It's now my immense pleasure to introduce Gabriella Coleman to the stage. As Lucia Pietrojusti said, and she expresses all our feelings about that, it's our dream come true that Gabriella is here, because already in previous marathons, the 89 Plus marathon, last year's marathon, we wanted to invite her for those topics as well, but schedule prevented, so it's wonderful that Gabriella can be with us today. Gabriella is trained as a cultural anthropologist and researcher, as a writer and teacher on computer hacking and digital activism. Her first book was Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, and it's certainly one of the books I've seen most in artist studios over the last couple of years, a great inspiration for the art world and beyond. Her new book, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous, has been named as Kirkus Review's best book of 2014. Coleman holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University, and will now be presenting a talk focusing on ideas of infrastructure, hacking, activism, and cultural anthropology. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Gabriella Coleman.
Well, it is a real pleasure to be here. They were fantastic talks this morning, and this talk actually is a nice complement to the one that just happened. So back in the late 1990s, when I was working in the jungles of British Guyana on spirit possession, I was on the fast track to becoming a very traditional anthropologist. Then I was dramatically lured away by a quite unconventional topic for my field, computer hackers. Now why? Why did I turn away? Well, I turned to the question of computer hackers after someone told me about a hacker free software license called the copyleft. I was struck by its clever logic. As its name suggests, it's very different from the copyright. In fact, it's an anti-copyright license built on the very perch of a copyright. However, software that's licensed with a copyleft license is first copyrighted. In this way, the copyleft short-circuits its nemesis by using it to mandate access and sharing of software. It was my first exposure to what I think of as the very clever politics of hacking, which is often built on a tight coupling between craft, excellence in understanding and making, and craftiness, and aesthetics of cleverness or deviousness. So I was impressed by this legal reinvention. I jumped ship, and I've spent nearly 20 years on the form, content, and consequences of hacker politics. And obviously, I've been very busy with WikiLeaks, Anonymous, and many other forums. So let me return to the copyleft, because its logic is quintessentially parasitical, which is one of the themes that was put on the table for the transformation. It was the brainchild of the hacker Richard Stallman, who sought to preserve the culture of hacking and especially sharing that he felt was strangled or being strangled by the introduction of copyrights and patents into software production. Now, what's interesting about this story is that initially Stallman, when he thought of the idea of free software, did not come up with the idea of a license. In fact, the law was an enemy to combat. It was not a friend to court. Licensing was the original problem. It didn't seem like the right approach. Now, a couple of years after the idea of free software was invented, there was a very complicated legal controversy. I can't get into that. But Stallman was forced to reconcile that the law was the problem with the fact that then he had to use the law to create a moral community around sharing. And this is when the idea of the copyleft was born, and he used the copyright in the process. Now, hackers like Richard Stallman are keenly aware that all systems, even very well-built systems, have cracks in them, and these cracks are ripe for exploitation. He used the letter of the law relating to intellectual property to create a new spirit of the law, where once applied, copyright claims could be legally guaranteed to never apply. So once the copyleft became more well-known, it tapped into a deep discontent many citizens felt towards the intellectual property law system that has granted corporations a whole lot of power to regulate and control creative content. The copyleft eventually became an infectious agent, spreading into different zones. It inspired other social actors to mimic this legal solution and to port it to other areas. The most famous of these is the Creative Commons, an organization that has built similar licenses. Now, parasitical political methods, such as the copyleft, may be rare, but when they're discovered, they're extremely transformative. The idea of something that both abuses and in the act also uses and creates something new is a beautiful thing. Hacking, indeed, is well suited to generate such solutions, and it is no surprise that such productive parasitism can be discovered when hackers apply themselves to the political field. So, for example, hackers can easily poach time on the job to work on activist projects. Many managers, after all, most especially non-technical managers, well, they can't tell the difference between one screen that looks like the Matrix from another. And I know many activists who've really poached a lot of time at work to build up their activist projects. Since hackers are indispensable laborers in the global capitalist system, a system wholly dependent on computers, well, they are well positioned to sabotage the system from the inside out, a trend that I believe is on the rise. And that's a tweet from Phineas Fisher, a hacker, or a group of hackers, who has recently hacked into 2 security companies and basically stole a lot of data and emails and put them online. And this is a form of sabotage, which I think will be more common in the future. It's both leaking and also seeking to disrupt the corporations. So parasitical politics may be rare, but I think that there's many lessons embodied in them. And in specific, I'd like to spend the rest of my talk on the way that parasitical politics forsakes purity. Even though Richard Stallman is known to be fervently puritanical in his commitment to free software, nevertheless, he was willing momentarily to forsake purity. Had Stallman been a purist when faced with a problem, he might have never entertained using the very law, the copyright, that was causing the enclosures he so loathed. Now, sometimes being a purist and drawing stark boundaries and borders and ideologies is vitally important, but in other cases, a desire for purity can be counterproductive. So allow me to explain with a personal example, which is the moment where I started to think about this. Long ago, I was involved in an endeavor with various tech collectives to federate them. Some of the collectives were radical, some were liberal, and we spent many, many months putting aside those differences to share resources. Finally, we met in person, and it looked like we were on the verge of an agreement, and somehow one participant suggested, well, we really have to come up with 10 principles we all have to agree to, including veganism, and then that kind of opened a can of worms, and the whole kind of process imploded. During this time, I was actually in the midst of research on open source software development, and what struck me was how different these leftists were operating from these open source software developers who would never seek people to pledge an allegiance to a very specific list of ideological commitments, maybe outside of free software, and even that, not always, in order to participate. And it was one of the reasons why they had such kind of increased participation. So now I'm going to turn to a few other examples in the hacker habitat that shows this kind of refusal of purity in politics. The first example draws from Anonymous, which we heard a little bit about. It's currently a disruptive protest ensemble, which I've spent many years researching and writing about. There's different individuals, groups, some connected, some unconnected, who use the banner to orchestrate different genres of collective action, from hacking to street protests around the world. Now, some leftists love Anonymous, others detest them. There's many reasons behind the love, many reasons behind the hate, but those that dislike them often cite their lack of ideological clarity and purity. And you know what? They're not wrong. Anonymous is known for its wicked deception and their vulgar, offensive culture of humor. Its participants do refrain from articulating a well-thought-out political program. Anonymous, I like to say, resembles a hydra with many different heads and nodes, some of which are at odds with each other. Eventually, Anonymous themselves recognized their own impure politics, and they adopted the refrain, "Anonymous is not unanimous." In contrast to a politics that seeks clarity or consensus, Anonymous aligns more closely with the type of adversarial politics advocated by radical theorists like Chantal Mouffe, where strife and agonism are part of the terrain. Anons often disagree and they engage in a blistering war of words, but very little energy is spent on trying to eliminate difference, especially when doing so would mean arriving at some weak middle ground resolution. Now, it's pretty much impossible to arrive at consensus because of the way Anonymous is configured. While in many ways Anonymous operates along an open source logic, nowhere is their openness more apparent than in their name. Free for taking and remaking by anyone who would claim it. This is where its impure politics becomes most manifest. It's impossible to control the meaning and purpose of Anonymous. These characteristics go some way also in explaining why Anonymous has behaved infectiously, spreading far and wide across the world, in Japan, in India, in Macedonia, and Chile. And in fact, a recent study that scraped data from social media has helped corroborate what we could only gauge before, that it's quite global in character and quite large. But it also means that in some places, like Germany, there's some anonymous nodes that take a quite conservative bent. So let me turn now to a very different example of impurity concerning the encryption project Tor, which helps you be anonymous online. So like many open source projects and unlike Anonymous, they're pretty well organized. And it is one of the more robust anonymity projects. A 2013 classified document that had been leaked described it as the king of high secure, low latency anonymity. Now, one of the reasons why they have thrived is because they've secured copious funding from the government. In 2013 alone, they received nearly $2 million from the US government. Now, some critics decry this as foul play and as a deeply, deeply corrupting force. One critic put it this way: the Tor project more resembles a spook project than a tool designed by a culture that values accountability or transparency, and it was in part because of this kind of infusion of government money. Now, I think it's important to raise the question, but I'm currently unconvinced. As currently formulated, the critique stems in part from an critical commitment to purity. The fact that many of its core developers are able to work full-time on Tor is indeed an achievement. It's naive to think that one can build and maintain a complicated tool from volunteer labor alone. It's also hard to get kind of commercial money for it. Without the money, the project would limp along much more slowly, hurting their political cause to build this robust privacy tool. If anything, their ability to land government grants should lead us to recognize an often ignored reality. There's no monolithic block of power behind the US or similar governments. Like any gargantuan entity, the government is composed of competing groups and branches, and you can exploit that for your own ends. I think it's more important to consider how they've managed to get so much money, because I suspect there's a little bit of craftiness and cleverness in how they've been able to do it. Of course, they also have roots in the military itself. That's where the project was first concocted. Still, I think it may be too premature to say anything too definitive about this relationship because, in fact, more research is warranted. My sense is that some of the funds certainly can direct where labor is expended on this versus that, but it also matters that Tor is run as an open source project where core developers dictate the goals. It matters that the code, the underlying directions of the software is available to audit. It matters that they have mechanisms to be transparent and accessible to the wider cryptography community. Notably, they have a blog where they address very controversial issues, and a weekly newsletter which reports on more mundane technical developments. More significant, perhaps, is Tor has become part of a very uber-politicized domain of hacker politics. Between crackdowns against hackers like Julian Assange here in London and the revelations provided by the Snowden leaks, which shows mass surveillance, many members of this hacker public, including Tor developers, hold a deeply antagonistic or at least skeptical relation to the state. With these two examples in place, allow me to wrap up with a few final thoughts. To take impurity seriously in politics partly stems from philosophical questions. A political mindset built on binaries, either you're with us, you're against us, you accept the full program or you don't, where there's no in-betweens, well, I think this matches poorly to the reality of social life. Not only do humans face a multitude of ever-shifting constraints that invariably will shape how politics are configured, but we're also complex and contradictory animals. Even when a group of people may seem to share aspirations and ideological commitments, there will always be differences and disagreements, some major, some minor. This is in part due to the enormous plurality of social life stemming from class and gender experience, but it's also connected to the fact that we hold difference of opinion over strategies. Still, it's best not to be too dogmatic, even about this belief. I'm not advocating for a single moral paradigm or a single amoral paradigm for politics. It's worth considering the strategic advantages of using impurity tactically and selectively. I'm putting on the table that there's benefits by foregoing purity, instead choosing to be wily and unconventional in political pursuits. At times, being impure is about being devious or provocative or courting controversy, as Anonymous often does in order to publicize an issue. In other instances, it means shedding all provocative language and feigning neutrality and creating a big tent to enroll more people in your radical cause. It means forming unholy allegiances. Maybe more policy types shouldn't write Anonymous off, as it can help their cause. And in fact, some policy folks in NGOs, very traditional NGOs, did work with some Anonymous members behind the scenes during crucial moments, and they were very productive. And I understand why they had to keep hitting. Others were just like, no way, they're terrible for our cause. It means, at times, being open to different possibilities and to experimentation and mistakes. Now, really just to conclude, making the decision to entertain the use of impure methods is the easy part. The real interesting and most especially ethically thorny and difficult dimensions of political organizing is when and where to be impure, when and where to draw those lines, but that's the subject of another talk. So thank you very much.